In this section, we're going to talk about mood or affective disorders. So affect with an A is the same as a mood. So you can have a positive affect if you're in a good mood or a negative affect if you're in a bad mood. And to link this to our previous topic when we were talking about anxiety disorders, anxiety and mood disorders are two of the most common types of disorders that people tend to experience. And interestingly, a lot of people that have anxiety disorders also tend to have mood disorders and vice versa. So if they're co-occurring in this situation, you could call it a comorbidity, where people tend to have both at the same time. Now, when we want to start talking about depression, which is one of the most common mood disorders, depression is going to be a lot more than just feeling sad. Everyone at some point in their life is going to feel really sad and really down and in a really poor mood. Depression is a lot more than that. It's not just a case of the blues or having a really bad day. If someone has clinical depression, then they're experiencing something where the frequency, intensity, and duration of their symptoms is out of proportion to the situation. Kind of the same way as when we were talking about anxiety, where what's happening is out of proportion to the situation. Just in this case, the thing that's happening is that depressed state, that really low mood. If people are classified as having major depression, then their depression is so severe that they're usually unable to function effectively. So that lowered mood ends up impacting pretty much every aspect of their lives. A less intense form of depression is dysthymia, which is the old name. They now call it chronic depressive disorder. But it's basically a less dramatic version of depression where you have these chronic disruptions to your mood. And so in this case, even though it's not as crippling as having major depression where you can't function normally, that chronic depressive disorder is basically long-term, so over months or even years, where you go without having a normal or positive mood. And so if we want to look at the different aspects that contribute to experiencing depression, same as when we looked at anxiety, we can have emotional symptoms and cognitive symptoms and motivational symptoms and somatic symptoms. So 4 different categories here that contribute to depression. So for the emotional side of things, these are the things that you are feeling. So you might feel sad, which you kind of assume is coming along with depression. But it's more to it than just sadness. You can also experience hopelessness, that feeling that there's no hope, there's no chance of getting out of this depression, there's no chance of bettering the future. This can also link with anxiety. That's that comorbidity with anxiety. You can also have just overall misery. So you're not just sad, but you feel miserable. And a really tough one is this inability to enjoy things, where you stop getting enjoyment from the parts of your life that you usually enjoy. In terms of cognitive symptoms, a major component of depression is how you start shaping or framing your world. So if you have negative cognitions or negative thoughts about yourself, the world, and the future, it's going to keep you in that depressive state. So if someone is depressed, they're a lot more likely to think negatively of themselves. They might think that they're a terrible person, that they're worthless, that things are never going to improve, thinking about their future, or thinking that maybe the world is better off without them. These are all cognitive symptoms of depression that perpetuate depression. For motivational symptoms, a lot of the time, along with depression, you end up with a loss of interest. You find it really difficult to be interested in things that you usually enjoy. A lack of drives. You have no motivation to do things. And you might have difficulty starting tasks. This makes it really difficult to function in everyday life. And this is why major depression can have such a negative impact on how you live, because it makes it really difficult for you to do anything. And in terms of somatic symptoms, these are sort of physical things that you start experiencing, things like loss of appetite, a lack of energy, having difficult sleeping, or having difficulty sleeping, and losing or gaining weight. So these are all involved in your somatic nervous system, where your body's basically not functioning the way it should because of depression. And I covered all of these points on the previous slide, so this is unimportant. The next topic we want to talk about is bipolar disorder, which is related to depression because one of the components, so when you see the prefix bi, you assume there are two things. So in this disorder, you have two bi opposing forces happening. So they are polar opposites. So this is going to be depression, and usually depression is the main component of bipolar disorder. So when someone has bipolar disorder, they spend a lot of time in that depressive state, but the depression alternates with mania. And so mania is going to be a more high energy state. So depression tends to be very low energy, all of that reduced and sadness and lowered mood. But for bipolar disorder, the mania side of things is going to give you this manic energy. So people tend to report feeling euphoric. They feel really good, lots of energy. Sometimes it comes along with grandiose cognitions or grandiose thoughts. So they think of themselves as being really important and really big, and all of this excess energy comes out in more rapid speech. Having more energy also leads to them doing more things. So we talked about having issues with motivation when you're depressed. If someone with bipolar disorder is in a manic state, if they're on that mania side of things, they're going to be overly motivated. Maybe they're going to do lots of work. Maybe they're going to get everything done in the day. Maybe they're going to clean their whole house. And people who have bipolar disorder, sometimes the swing between both ends of the spectrum can be fairly rapid. So maybe you're in a manic state and you start cleaning your house only for you to lose that state, and you swing back to depression, and now your house is torn apart because you didn't finish cleaning. So there's sort of both sides of the spectrum in this disorder. Now, the textbook goes into a lot of details on the prevalence of mood disorders. So how likely is it for someone to have a mood disorder? And the current evidence says that about 1 in 20 North Americans is going to fall under the description of severely depressed. And statistically, you have pretty high chances of having a depressive episode that would count as a clinical depressive episode at least one point in your life. So about 1 in 5 people at some point will count as clinically depressed for some period of time. And so there's lots and lots of studies on depression because, again, mood disorders are one of the most common disorders to experience. And so a lot of these studies are showing that depression is on the rise in young individuals. So a lot of people in the range of 15 to 19 years old are starting to get depression more often. And so they have two different age ranges, so 15 to 19 and 18 to 25, just different studies look at different groups and sort of chunk everything together different ways. But basically, we're seeing a lot more cases of clinical depression in young individuals. And for the degree of how much of an increase we're seeing, so for people born after the 1960s, so people sort of after the baby boomer phase, they're 10 times more likely to experience depression than their grandparents were. That is massive. And that's even taking into account the fact that if we look at their life expectancy of getting depression, their grandparents may still be alive or may have lived full lives, and people born since then are only partway through their lives. So even without controlling for reduced lifespan or whatever, though, having not lived quite as long yet, we're still seeing a tenfold increase in likelihood of depression. And that is absolutely massive. So something is going on that's causing this increase in depression. And we'll come back to one of the explanations that the textbook proposes in just a little bit. But again, this is another one of those really complicated topics that there could be a lot more to it if only we had the time. We, of course, want to look at gender differences. So women are a lot more likely to suffer from, they call it unipolar depression here, which is basically depression alone. Sort of in the same vein as bipolar disorder, talking about depression plus mania. Unipolar depression is just clinical depression. Women are the most likely to suffer their first episode of depression in their 20s. Men tend to have their first occurrence of depression in their 40s. So women experience depression much, much earlier in their lives than men tend to. And this is just on average. This isn't everyone. So again, keep that in mind. For bipolar disorder, it doesn't seem to have the same sex differences that we see for clinical depression. And this diagram here shows an interesting graphic of how people tend to experience major depressive episodes. So when we look at people who have ever experienced a major depressive episode, so that's what this is saying here at the top. So if someone has a period of depression that's severe enough to count as clinical depression, for about 50% of them, that depression will reoccur. So it's not just a one-time event. In about half of cases, people will experience it again. In about 10% of people, they don't recover from that initial experience into depression. So they suffer major depression that once, and they end up falling into chronic depression, where they don't go back to quote-unquote normal. So for this 50% here, depression will reoccur, but it isn't constant. It would just be periodically they experience depression. This 10% is they stay in that depressed state. And interestingly, about 40% of people, after having a single major depressive episode, will never have another experience with major depression. So it's kind of an interesting division of how people proceed after a major depressive episode. So for the next little bit, we're going to talk about some of the factors that are influencing having these mood disorders. And again, I don't love the word causal here. We'll go with things that are related to. So if we start looking at our biological factors, and specifically when we're looking at depression or monopolar depression, as the textbook likes to switch between, you probably won't be surprised that there are genetic factors. So you can look at twin studies and see that if you are an identical twin or a monozygotic twin that has depression, your identical twin is more likely to have depression too than if you were dizygotic twins, same as last time. So twin studies give us some evidence for genetic factors. Of course, they've also done things like adoption studies and so on and so forth. Lots and lots of evidence for genetic factors influencing depression. There are also measurable biochemical differences between neurotransmitters expressed in the brains of people who have depression and people who don't have depression. And so those who experience depression tend to have an underactivity or a lower quantity of norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin present in their brains than people who don't have depression. When we look at the same idea, but for bipolar disorder has a much stronger genetic component than just depression, which is really interesting. So there's a lot higher concordance rate between identical twins when you're looking at bipolar disorder versus just depression or monopolar depression. And for quantifying that, about 50% of people who have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder have an immediate relative who also has bipolar disorder. So it's not just looking at twins, but say children or parents. There's sort of a 50-50 chance of having an immediate relative who also has the disorder. And for that genetic side of things, we have a 5 times higher concordance rate with identical twins, the ones that share 100% of their genes, versus fraternal twins, the ones that only share 50% of their genes. So having more common genetics, by having more of the same genes, you have a much higher chance of both having bipolar disorder. Again, strong indicator that there's a genetic component. And there's some evidence that for a lot of these sort of manic-related disorders, so things that have that mania component, like bipolar, maybe it's an overactivity of neurotransmitters. So unlike just depression, where it's an underactivity of these specific transmitters, there's some theory that maybe the mania side of things happens when there's too much of certain neurotransmitters. And the question mark means we're not quite sure what's going on, but maybe that's what's going on. If we want to look at psychological factors that might influence people into having mood disorders, if we fall under the category then of personality-based vulnerability, this is where we can start looking at sort of psychoanalysts like Freud and their psychodynamic view, where they would point at the fact that early traumatic losses are shaping who you are as a person, shaping your personality. And indeed, even modern research has found that people who lose a parent early on in life end up being more prone to developing mood disorders. Also, people who experience rejection, they tend to feel vulnerable, and that predisposes them for mood disorders as well. As another possible explanation, in the current generation, or I guess in more recent generations, because this research was actually done in the 80s, so it's not so much modern, but there was the proposal that newer generations are more self-focused. They're concerned about their own happiness and their own state of being. And as this focus has moved inward, we start becoming more prone to depression because we're so focused on ourselves. Our sense of self-worth comes from the things that we have attained, the things that we have accomplished. And if we're not accomplishing things, then we don't feel like we're worth much, which, as you can imagine, might be associated with depression. And that kind of starts bleeding over into our humanistic views. So how we view ourselves and what we're trying to accomplish. And so as we are more self-focused and as we define our self-worth based on what we can accomplish, we start to react a little bit more strongly to failures. So if I fail, it's because I have done something wrong. So I would maybe internalize that. Maybe it's due to my inadequacy as a person, and that's going to lead me to feel sad and depressed. And maybe I feel meaningless. I feel worthless because I'm not contributing. I'm not accomplishing anything. So that's a potential way that's feeding into that increase in depression and other mood disorders in recent years. Next is an interesting section where we can delve into the cognitive processes involved in depression. And there's lots and lots of research looking at this, but one subset of research focuses on what they call the depressive cognitive triad, basically saying that there are 3 repeated thoughts, things that we are cognizant of, that tend to be associated with depression. So people who have depression tend to have negative thoughts that center around the world, themselves, and the future. So if you think negatively about who you are as a person, and you think negatively about the world and what's going on around you, and you have a bleak outlook on the future, all of those thoughts combined can lead you to experience depression. The way that you're framing everything around you is negative, and it makes you more prone to depression. And so these negative thought processes lead us to thinking more negatively more often. We can't suppress negative thoughts because most of our thoughts are negative now. And this sort of bias towards thinking in a negative fashion ends up having quite a few other effects that we can measure. So individuals who have these negative thought processes, who start experiencing depression, recall their failures a lot more readily than they do successes. This might be something to do with, say, mood congruent recall, where it's a lot easier to remember things that make you sad when you're sad than it is to remember things that are happy. But also, when we're depressed, we're a lot faster at identifying sad faces than happy faces. Maybe, again, because they match our mood. So once we're in that state where we've adopted a negative affect, when we're in that sort of depressive range, we start associating more readily with depressive things. In depression, we also see this pattern of a depressive attributional pattern. So this is actually going to go a little bit against what we had seen in a previous chapter, where people like to take credit for their successes and blame the environment or blame the system for their failures. People with depression do the opposite. That's where this depressive attributional pattern comes up, where if they succeed, it's due to something outside of themselves, factors beyond them. I succeeded because the test was easy, or I succeeded because the teacher was good, or something external. But they internalize negative outcomes. So if they fail, it's because of themselves. So I failed the test because I'm not smart enough, because I'm not a good student, because whatever. So those sort of reversal of normal attributions tends to go hand in hand with depression. And again, once you're in that depressive state and you adopt these kinds of patterns, it tends to perpetuate staying in that depressed state. And people who are in that situation, they can encounter what's called learned helplessness. So once you've been in that depressed state for so long, once you've experienced enough negativity, you start to expect that bad events are going to occur and there's nothing you can do about it. So if you're in that state of learned helplessness, you might think, well, there's a test coming up, and if I don't study, I'm not going to do well. If you've learned helplessness, you might also think, why bother studying? I'm not going to do well anyways, so why try? So that sort of defeatist attitude, that idea that I can't do anything to help this situation, that's learned helplessness. And in that vein of learning, we can also have learned aspects to acquiring that depression and that negative thought pattern. Now, for this section about sort of our loss of reinforcement and so on, I actually have the image on the wrong slide. I apologize here. But this slide is going to relate, or this diagram here is going to relate a little bit to both slides, but flip back and forth a bit. But so we're talking about loss of reinforcement. So that's sort of like this first stage where you started just being a little bit depressed. And so that depression leads you to reduce your reward-seeking behavior. So you're removing that reinforcement. So if you're not doing things that make you feel good, then you're losing the reinforcement to do good things. So you lose that reward-seeking behavior, you start avoiding others, so you've removed the potential for feeling good by being around other people and doing things that make you happy. And by removing yourself from those rewarding factors, those rewarding aspects, you end up in a level of increased depression. So depression is happening. You're losing your social support because you're withdrawing. You're falling deeper into depression. And the more depressed you feel, you start having behaviors that end up pushing people away. The more depressed you are, the sadder you act. That's sort of a toxic environment. So people don't necessarily want to be around you because you're so low. You're draining the environment and people aren't enjoying being around you. So more problems, deeper depression, and again, you're removed from any kind of positive reinforcement from being around people because you started withdrawing from people and you pushed people away. So there's this whole cycle where once you have depression, it tends to perpetuate itself. Lots of behaviors that make you stay that way. And then in terms of environmental factors that are related to depression, some of them can come from childhood, based on how you were raised, how your parents raised you. So if you're raised in very stressful situations, if you don't learn a lot of coping skills, then as you get older, when you face situations that you can't cope with, where you don't have the tools to handle them, you could start experiencing depression because you're feeling overwhelmed and you start withdrawing and you start into this spiral. So poor parenting can set you up for being overwhelmed by stressful situations. Sometimes you can have an okay raising where your parents don't set you up to be predisposed to depression, but if you encounter enough stressful experiences, if you have enough environmental influences, it can still push you towards depression. So not having good coping skills, whether that came from your parents or just not experiencing enough things to develop healthy coping mechanisms, or maybe some of your coping skills are those unhealthy ones we've talked about in the past. Things like avoidance or redirecting things or stuff like that. So unhealthy coping skills are also bad. Lack of coping skills, not so good. Failure to develop positive self-concept. If you don't have a lot of self-esteem, if you don't value yourself, then that first aspect of the triad of depression or depressive thoughts, where you think lowly of yourself, it's already there. So just another factor that can contribute to you being predisposed towards depression. And as you might expect, there is of course going to be a bunch of sociocultural factors. Society and culture have a major influence on how you perceive the world, so of course it's going to affect your predisposition towards depression. And we can see this in variation between different cultures. Depression seems to be a lot more common in Western cultures or individualistic cultures than they are in collectivistic cultures. So maybe it's a matter of focusing on the self. In individualistic cultures, you put all of the pressure on you as an individual, whereas in collectivistic cultures, it's us as a group, and there's less pressure on you as an individual. And so that can lead to feelings of guilt and inadequacy as an individual if you fail. So a lot of internalizing related to your culture. And we tend not to see gender differences in development of these kinds of disorders in developing countries. So countries that aren't quite collectivistic or individualistic, where they haven't quite settled, then there isn't really this divide.